thought we had like 2 or 3 more weeks left of August, and I knew I had to speak the last Sunday in August. So, yeah. I started the week thinking I was going to be speaking on something else, and on Wednesday I realized I wasn't even speaking on that. And I started reading in Exodus, and I'm just going to try to let the passage itself speak and glean some stuff for us that we can practically learn from and apply to our lives. So we're actually going to be talking about Exodus. We're going to be looking at the book of Exodus, not the whole thing, because it'll be here forever. Just 2 chapters, which is still kind of a lot. But chapters 32 and 33. Dyslexia is the worst. And we're going to actually look at a dynamic duo of Aaron and Moses. And I think probably all of you are familiar with this passage because it kind of has this ridiculousness to it. If you read through it, there's a few things in it that are just kind of like, what? So I want to kind of look at some of these things that happen in these 2 chapters, and I don't know you, but I learned a lot that I didn't know previously when I started really poring over these chapters and really asking God, what is this passage really talking about? What am I supposed to do with this? So first, let's talk about Aaron and Moses. We know who Moses was, right? Moses was probably the most famous prophet for the nation of Israel. They look at him as the guy who, he's the guy who brought the law down from Mount Sinai from God. So that's a pretty big deal. But Aaron, he was actually Moses' older brother. And in Egypt, if you go back to their time in Egypt, we see that God asked Moses to do something, and Moses is like, oh, but I can't speak. So he's like, well, your brother Aaron, he'll do the speaking for you. But then he really didn't have to do very much speaking. So it'd be great if I had someone who could speak for me right now.
Where's your brother Aaron?
Where's my brother Aaron? Anyways, so Aaron, he was actually an older brother of Moses, which I think is a nice little detail because he must have been a pretty humble guy to submit to his brother's authority and follow him around a desert for basically the rest of his life, doing whatever God told Moses to do. I think both Moses and Aaron were pretty humble guys. They both made a lot of mistakes, and we get to kind of see and learn from their mistakes, but we also see that God used those mistakes to show his own faithfulness, but ultimately to bring the nation of Israel and fulfill a promise to his friend Abraham that they would be in the promised land. And he used Moses and Aaron as these people to fulfill that promise. Aaron was a high priest for the Levites, so I don't know about you, but I expect like a priest to know God pretty well, right? Yeah, maybe that's just me, but so they had seen a lot of really cool things. God did a lot in the book of Exodus that if we were witness to today, our jaws would be on the ground most of the time. And I think that's important to realize when we look at these people to remember what they saw, what they were exposed to. Because their experiences do matter. So, they had before this chapter happens, we see them that they have crossed the Red Sea, they have left Egypt, they have left their slavery behind, and God has done some pretty awesome things like, parting the Red Sea, and they walk through on dry ground, and they get done, they're over there, and they're worshiping God because they just saw him part the Red Sea and bring them out of Egypt, and there's no doubt who just accomplished this. It's God. So they're worshiping him all out, and there's I think Moses' sister is leading them all with a tambourine. So if you don't like our worship, I think you'll probably like theirs less, because I think there's a lot of people who have tambourine hate in their life. But the first worship service we see with the nation of Israel is some woman leading them with a tambourine. It's interesting. Anyways, that's a side note. That wasn't in my notes. They get to the other side of the Red Sea, and they have to walk through the desert, and Israel gets all hot and sweaty and irritable, like they're on some new experimental drug or something, and they're just complaining and they're upset, and God provides them with fresh water, and he gives them bread from heaven, like literally from heaven. It just shows up on the ground, and they get to eat it, and it's exactly what they need. They even, right before this section that we're about to read, they had even encountered enemies in the desert. And these enemies they went to war with these guys. I believe they were the Amalek. Is that right? That might be wrong. But anyways, they go to war with these guys, and God tells Moses that as long as your hands are above your head and you're holding the staff in the air, that Israel will prevail over these enemies. But if your hands get weak and they go down, then they'll prevail over you. And we see Moses' friend, you guys know his name, just say it. Joshua, thank you. Joshua and some other guy named Hur, they hold up Moses' arms until Israel actually overcomes their enemy. So there's just a lot of random details in this chapter, in this book so far, that really point to God being powerful and sovereign, and Israel gets to witness this firsthand. And then they get to this place called Mount Sinai, and I did a lot of research, being sidetracked about where Mount Sinai is, because a lot of people don't think it's actually in the Sinai Peninsula, but it's over in Arabia, and there's a bunch of interesting details about that. So I was going to give you a map, but I don't know where to point on the map, so you don't. But regardless of where Mount Sinai is, we know what happened there in great detail. And in chapter 20 of Exodus, we read about the Ten Commandments, which we all probably, I remember when I was growing up, there was a song that we used to learn in church. I'm not going to sing it for you now, but everyone's pretty familiar with the Ten Commandments that was given to Israel. And Israel managed to break almost half of them by the time they received them when they came down the mount. So by the time we reach chapter 32 of Exodus, we find Israel has gotten really impatient with Moses. I don't know how long he was up on the mountain, but while he was up there speaking with God, which, by the way, if we read what that looked like, I think I probably said this last time. I just love reading this passage, because the description of God's presence on Mount Sinai is like this crazy hurricane, lightning, thunderstorm that also involves fire of some sort, bearing down on Mount Sinai, and the entire mountain is shaking. In fact, Moses is told, hey, bring all the people, set up a barrier, you need to consecrate the ground, because God's presence is going to be here, and they should not cross that barrier. And Israel all comes, and they're watching God's presence come down, and they step way back, because they're not getting caught up in whatever's happening on that mountain. It was dangerous. So God's presence is pretty impressive. They took it very seriously. So Moses, he actually goes up onto Mount Sinai, and he is talking with God, speaking with God. It says he's speaking with God as man would speak with his friend. And God is relaying the law, this covenant he was creating with Israel to set them apart, to make him his people, so that they could live in his presence. Not a people who were distant from God, but because of God's law, it was a mercy to them, and they could live in his presence with him and be a people who were distinct from others. So here is Israel camping on Mount Sinai, and while God's presence is bearing down like a hurricane on the mountain, Moses is there speaking, and we read a pretty jarring passage in chapter 32, when the people of Israel come to Aaron and ask him for something. So I'm just going to start reading, and Exodus 32, verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Okay, so real quick, two things stand out to me in this verse so far. First, they wanted a God who would go before them. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but I want everyone to remember their request. They wanted a God who would go before them. Let's hold on to that and come back to that in a little bit. Second, who do they give credit for bringing them out of Egypt? Moses. 20 chapters back, they were celebrating and giving God all of the credit. They were worshiping him. And now, they're giving Moses the credit. And I don't think it's credit. I think it's more like, yo, Moses, like when someone wakes you up out of bed and you're not ready to go yet? Like, oh, Moses, the guy who woke me up from my sleep. They're saying it not in a positive way. These two things should alarm Aaron. Plus, the other alarming thing is that they want him to make them a god. There's a bit of idolatry, requesting idolatry, which we're going to talk about plenty. But these should really alarm Aaron, right? He's a high priest. He's supposed to know how to worship and who to worship and how to help the people do those things. So we read, Aaron answers them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives and your sons and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with tools. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Okay, so they're changing their story again. So Aaron does what they ask him. And I don't know what the time frame was here. How long, did they ask him more than once? It just indicates that they asked him and he did it. And interestingly enough, he makes it for them. He makes this idol for them, but it costs them, right? They have to give their own gold and their own jewelry, and it is going to be used to fashion something for them. And then Aaron uses his own hands, right, to shape the idol that Israel would see and touch. And then they would proceed to give this thing that they saw take shape before them and give it credit for what they saw God do in Egypt and across the Red Sea. And if we're honest, we could sit here and think that's really stupid, right? I mean, it's 2019 and we don't do stupid things like this. Someone makes something and we don't suddenly claim that it did something it didn't do, right? Israel had to know that this hunk of gold carved out by Aaron didn't actually lead them out of Egypt. Do we think that they were stupid? I think sometimes I fall into this trap where I read something and I think that the ancients were idiots. Come on. We're so much more enlightened and educated now. We don't fall into these traps. And when I'm tempted to think that, I think I need to, what was really happening in this passage? What was really going on? Because Israel they might have been a stubborn people. God even calls them stubborn. He doesn't call them stupid, though. So, what was really going on here? Because they had to know, right? They're standing in view of the mountain that God is bearing down on like a hurricane. This God that led them through the desert with a pillar of fire and a cloud of smoke and crossed the Red Sea and all the plagues that happened. They saw all of these things take place. They know in their minds they worshipped the God who had done this. And now they're giving credit to it while they can see what he's doing to this golden calf. So, what's the deal with the golden calf? I think if we look at the text, continue reading, we realize that it's not quite as it appears. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar. When he saw the people worshiping this calf and saying that it had brought them out of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." And you can see how capital all caps, Lord. When we read that in the Old Testament, that usually is an indication that the name used for God there is the name that God gave Israel for himself, which we believe is pronounced Yahweh or something like that. And this is God's own name that is his, not one that we have made up for him. So tomorrow there will be a festival to Yahweh. So it is not that Israel had just made this golden calf and made up this new deity. I don't think that's what's going on here. Because the next day the people rose up early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Or, yeah, this is revelry. My ESV says they got up to play. I think, according to the text, what I'm reading, is that this calf was somehow in the mind of Israel a representation or an interpretation of God Yahweh, who was on top of Mount Sinai right now. Interestingly enough, side note, they had built a calf, which would have been a familiar symbol, and actually in Canaanite culture, it was a god who was supposed to represent power and might and strength, which they would have been familiar with those things about God, because he had displayed those pretty well. In fact, if you read further ahead in 1 Kings 12, we see that Israel has this little civil war thing that happens, and the king in the north, who is Jeroboam, he is scared that the people in the north will abandon and go back to the south and reunite the two countries, and he won't be king anymore. So instead of having them go to Jerusalem to worship, he sets up these altars and makes these golden calves and has them set up so that they can stay in the north and worship God there. So this idea of a golden calf, this depicting God as this powerful thing, is something that they would have been familiar with. And I don't really know what Aaron's intention was, but if this calf was supposed to represent God, then it was a pretty crappy representation of God, okay? I mean, just picture this with me. Like, in your mind, you're standing, there's a mountain over here, and there's a hurricane, and there is fire and lightning, and you don't want to go near it. You, have to have those, solar eclipse goggles to look at it, okay? That's what's happening over here. No one's messing with that. And over here, we have this golden cow that we saw get built, and it's, I saw, it used to be something I would wear, and now it's this thing that I can look at and dance around and touch, and I can get really hyped about this thing that we've created, and I'm sorry, but that does not compare or at all make me think of that, right? If this is supposed to be a representation of God, then it is a misrepresentation. If this cow is supposed to represent God, can Israel really say that they know God? You want to see God, and this is what you come up with, even if they had made it as a symbol of power and strength, which are accurate descriptions of God, they created a very underwhelming depiction of him, especially in the light of what was happening on Mount Sinai. In wanting to see God, they wandered into idolatry. Not because they had created a literal idol, which they did, but in a much more deceptive and destructive way. They thought they were worshiping a version of Yahweh that they created themselves. And to construct a version of God that is anything less than himself is destructive and misleading, and it will lead us away from him. The people had deceived themselves and convinced themselves that they were really worshiping God. And how sad is that? We have people alive today who think that they are really worshiping God. Whatever version of God that they have come up with in their mind. But God does not recognize that as worship. So the people are pretty proud of themselves. They created this thing, they're dedicating it to Yahweh, and they're having a party. And it's a pretty loud party. They were really proud of themselves because on top of the mountain, we discover that they could hear what's going on down on the mountain. And actually, God tells tells Moses, hey, your people, what are they doing down there? And we read in verse 17, when Joshua heard the noise of the people, they were shouting, as they were shouting, he said to Moses, there is noise of war in the camp. But he said, it is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as they came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made, he burned it with fire and ground it into powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. Okay, so what angered Moses?
Idol worship.
Okay, idol worship, yes. He was coming down, he was hearing the party, but we don't see that he's angry until, not that they're partying, not that they're worshiping, but when he sees what they are worshiping, that's what angers him. It was what their worship was directed towards, the golden calf. And that's the thing. They didn't even realize it, that they were worshiping something other than God. But that's what idolatry does. It shifts our focus off of God or onto a false thing, something that isn't fulfilling, something that doesn't deserve our worship, or it forces our view onto a distorted view of God, or a lie about God that we have believed. And as much as we might like to think that we live in a culture that doesn't struggle with idolatry because we don't have physical idols made of gold and wood that we bow down to, I would say that this is something we should evaluate with a little more caution and not to dismiss. Because what's really happening here is something that we do still struggle with. Misplacing or misviewing God. Look around our society. It doesn't take very long to find someone who has a distorted view of God. How many people have heard things like, God can't forgive me. I can't go to church because I've done too much wrong. Or I need to get my life together first before I come here. That's based on a distorted view of God. Or a distorted view of Jesus. Our culture loves to make Jesus about something he wasn't about. Or make the gospel all about something that the gospel isn't really about. If the gospel isn't about Jesus, then it's not the gospel. When we worship a distorted view of God, we are essentially worshiping ourselves because we have made him about us, or made him in our own image. Israel wanted to see God, and Aaron showed them a distorted view of God. And we can be just as likely to be led towards a distorted view of God when we rely on others to see him. When we rely on someone else's experience of God, someone else who knows God, and we hear their stories, right? We aren't getting to know him when we hear those stories. We're just observing someone else's relationship. Jeff, I can sit here and I can hear you tell me all about your marriage, which you haven't done, by the way. No, just kidding. You can tell me all about your marriage. You can tell me all of the things you love about it, all of the good things about your wife. But me listening to you and observing your marriage doesn't make me a part of it at all. And he's thinking, thank goodness. Right? But that's what we do with God sometimes. We observe and we hear and we listen and we make up these ideas about God that are truth in our mind, and that is how we treat or relate to him. Others' experiences, don't get me wrong, okay? Others' experiences, like testimonies and stuff, those are valuable. And they can motivate us and they can encourage us, but they should not be our source of understanding of who God is. Because God wants to be seen and experienced. The entire Bible is a result of this reality. God reaching out and initiating relationship with a wandering mankind. But if we rely on someone else's view or experience or interpretation, we're going to run the risk of building our faith on something other than God. Something other than what he has already said. A distorted view of God will always lead you away from Him. And that's idolatry. And it is something that we still struggle with. It's something that it's easy for me to be like, you guys struggle with idolatry. I struggle with it too. Every day. Anytime something demands my loyalty or makes me choose between God and whatever it is that I desire. So Moses confronts Israel and forces them to choose. You can have this distorted view of God, this gold calf, or you can have Yahweh, who actually led you out of Egypt, who has provided for you over and over again, who has proven His faithfulness, who is strong and mighty, and His presence is bearing down on Mount Sinai like a hurricane right now. You can have this one that you can pack up and take with you, or you can have this one, but He can't be controlled. So according to verse 28, we read that at least 3,000 men had been led astray from God. They had built this thing and they had gotten so hyped up about it that they refused to see God how He wanted to be seen. They preferred their version. And ultimately, they would not back down. And they lost their lives. More than 3,000 people lost their lives because later it says war broke out in the camp. There was confusion and there was conflict. And the camp was devastated. The people can see the cost of their idolatry in a literal loss of life. And then in chapter 33, we see that that Moses has cleanup duty. And he has to go and he has to speak with God on behalf of Israel and see, what does God want to do now? Because here we are, your people, who want to live in your presence, and you are providing this way for us to do that, and while we're waiting, we're getting it completely wrong. Do you want to keep going forward with these idolatrous people? So, we read in verse 1 of chapter 33, the Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt." It's like that. Whenever I'm in trouble, I'm my father's son, not my mother's son. Right? God's kind of playing that way with Moses. "Depart up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, and the Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." When the people heard this word, when the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one would put on his ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you." Therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. So why are the people so distressed? I mean, they got what they wanted, right? They got exactly what they asked for in verse 32. They wanted a God who would go up before them, that they could take with them, and that they could just have the land. So God is just going to give them the land. He's going to win their battles still, right? He's going to give them an angel, and the angel's going to clear the land of all these people groups that are in the land that belongs to Israel. He's going to provide for them still. They're going to be in the land. But something is missing. And it's God's presence. Up until this time, they had been led through every situation with God's visible presence. Through a cloud or smoke or, a mountain that's erupting over there. They could see all of these markers of God's presence. And the thought of going into the promised land without God was terrifying to them. Which, this should at least comfort us a little bit, that suddenly their view was no longer on an idol, but it was on a correct version of God, a correct view of God, when they realized that they couldn't do anything without Him. Their hearts had been set back on God and a proper view of God, and without Him, they are lost. And Moses responds to God in verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore, I have found favor in your sight. Please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too, that this nation is your people." And he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Moses knew that without God's presence, that they would likely fall back into idolatry. Without God's presence, how would they discern what was God's will and what wasn't God's will? And he said to them, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall I know that I have found favor in your sight, and I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "This very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." It was God's presence with His people that set them apart from the rest of the world. Momentarily, Israel had forgotten that. And they had traded God's presence for a chunk of gold. And that chunk of gold didn't make them, it made them more like the rest of the world, not distinct from it. In Egypt, they had just left a land full of idols. They were headed into a land called Canaan. It was full of idols. God's presence was the only thing that made them different from the people that they were leaving and the people that they were headed towards. Amen. And if they wanted a chunk of metal, a version of God that they could pack up and take with them, a chunk of God that they could just get hyped about whenever they wanted to and leave tucked away someplace when they didn't, that made them more like the rest of the world. And God isn't interested in being worshipped that way. When Israel asked Aaron to make them a god, they wanted one that they could control, who could go before them and give them peace in the land. One that they had made with their own hands, who could basically secure their comfort and their security without them really having to obey or listen to it, because that idol's not talking back. Anytime that they talked to that idol, it was a monologue. And anything it did say was words that they were putting in its mouth. But God was interested in more than their comfort and their security, right? They wanted a God they were impatient. Moses is taking forever on the mountain. We want to go to the promised land now. Let's make a God and let's go. But God wasn't just interested in, think about it. What was the promise God made to Abraham? There are three of them. Big nation, which consisted of a lot of land and a lot of people. And that's the promised land, the people in the land. But there was a third blessing that God was pretty concerned about too. That Israel would be a blessing to the entire world. The whole purpose of the promised land wasn't just about Israel. He was concerned more than just about the nation of Israel. He was concerned about the entire world. And while Israel saw this version of God that would give them what they want, the promised land, they held on to that promise. Sometimes we read something in God's word and we're like, I'm holding on to that promise. I'm going to put that on a pillow. Right? And we claim that. That's ours. That's for me. And we make God's promises all about us. Right? That's what Israel had done. They remembered God's promise for the promised land. That was where their hope was. That was their true idol. God's promise. But God wasn't just interested in them. His concern was for the whole world. That's why the blessing isn't in the promised land, right? Because he was going to give them the promised land. You're gonna go in there. I'm gonna send an angel, he's gonna clear it out, you're gonna live there. Congratulations. But my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. The rest doesn't come from the promise or the land. It comes from God's presence. That was the true source of Israel's security, the presence of God with them wherever they went. And if Israel could be satisfied with God's presence in the wilderness, then they could see his presence as the blessing in the promised land. And Moses knew this. Without God's presence, Moses didn't want the promised land. Which that's a pretty big detail. Because Moses continued to obey God and do what he asked of him, and later he knew that he would never even enter the promised land. If that was the goal and Moses made this mistake and he chose to disobey God and to do something that God told him not to, and God said, listen, Moses, because of this, you're not going to be able to enter the promised land. But he continued to be faithful and to serve God because God's presence was more important than geography. The promise without the presence just makes the promise an idol. If we are content with God's promises apart from God's presence, then we have made an idol out of them. Our eyes aren't on God, but they're on his stuff. So, and maybe this whole thing was a test. Maybe God telling Moses that, I'm going to send an angel before you guys and you guys can have the land. Maybe this was a test. Because God seems satisfied with Moses' response. This very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. But Moses isn't quite satisfied, because he responds with another request in verse 18. Moses said, please show me your glory. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for man cannot see my face and live. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hands until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face you will not see. So, what's that request about, right? Show me your glory. That seems out of nowhere. But we just saw that God has said over and over, you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. Moses got to speak with God as a man speaks with his friend. And here he is speaking with God on a mountain, God's presence. I don't know about you, but I have not seen or experienced God the way that Moses has. If any of you have, I would love to hear about it. But here Moses is, he's gotten to see and experience God like no one before. And what does he ask for? He asks for more. Like, how dare you, right? God has already shown you more of himself than anyone else has seen, and you're asking for more? God knew Moses' name, and Moses wanted to know God by his name, which God had given to him. To know him the way that God knew Moses, for Moses to know God that way. Because God knows everything about Moses. His request, this show me your glory, was one of intimacy. Because Moses wanted to see God because he wanted to know and be known by God. And while God doesn't really grant his request in full, which, by the way, is to protect Moses from the danger of the unfiltered glory and presence of a holy God. God does grant him this request in part, and I think this group of verses right here reveals something really important about God. He wants to reveal himself. He wants to be seen and known by his people, and asking to see God isn't wrong. If it was wrong, why would God have shown Moses more of himself? Moses had already been exposed to him more than any of us, but he wanted more, which I think was a healthy desire, because there is always more of God to be known. And Moses had a hunger to know him. We should have a hunger to know God, to see him. I mean, Israel wasn't wrong either in wanting a God that they could see. I mean, they had some pretty great visuals going on over there, but they wanted something else. Moses wasn't wrong to want to see more of God, but the two people, Israel, Aaron, and Moses, they ended up in completely different places. And I think we have to be careful about how and why we want to see God. For Moses, it was all about intimacy. And by the way, the Israelites and Aaron and Moses, they weren't the last people to ask this exact same question. In John chapter 14, we get a glimpse into a conversation that Jesus has with his disciples where the same question is asked. And Jesus is the ultimate answer to anyone who wants to see God. In verse 6 of John chapter 14, Jesus said to him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." These words right here are some of the words that got Jesus in trouble with people who thought they knew God real well. And when someone else was claiming something about God that they didn't like, they got pretty upset about. Philip said to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough." Jesus said to him, "I have been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves." Jesus is God, completely visible, touchable, the Word of God made human flesh and bone. Paul says it like this in Colossians chapter 1. The Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. In him, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And in chapter 2, for in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. The God that Moses longed to see, we are told to fix our eyes on in Hebrews chapter 12. The God who protected and shielded Moses from his glory with his own hand is the God who hung on a cross with his hands nailed to wood, so that you and I could stand in his unfiltered presence. And while you and I have not literally seen and touched Jesus, the words that Jesus has for Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me, yet have believed." Those should be an encouragement for us. Because we do have firsthand accounts of Jesus, of how he lived and what he taught. And when he says, "Blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed," he's talking about you and me. Jesus has been revealed to us through his word and through the words and actions of faithful Christians who have come before us for thousands of years. And still, God is inviting us and our communities and our world into a community, into a relationship with himself, like the one he had with Moses, to speak with Jesus the way that we would speak with our friends. And that's how we're going to correct any distorted view of God we might have. Through reading his word, by talking with him about it, through his Spirit telling our spirit what is true and what is false. Right? Jesus promised that he would send his Spirit, the Spirit of truth. So we have that ability to discern truth within us through his Holy Spirit. And it's never going to contradict his word, so we better know it pretty well. After mulling through these 2 chapters of Exodus and reflecting on them, I had to kind of slow down because there was a lot of information there, and I got kind of excited about it. But I think there's a couple challenges for us in 2019 to kind of glean and evaluate for ourselves. First is my view of God, or whatever I've made God into, is my view of God more important than his reality? We hold a lot of beliefs about God that we have picked up from someone else, that we've experienced in our own lives some disappointment, and we've decided some things about God. Or, from a nice Instagram post, some pop theology book, we have a lot of ideas about who God is, who Jesus is, and what he was all about. Or how he feels towards me. How many of you have, I know Jesus loves me, but sometimes I don't think he likes me very much. Or how about those people that we don't tolerate very much? I feel like I know how God feels about them, right? I guarantee you that everyone here has some distorted view of God. And that's maybe not a very comfortable thing to hear, but Jesus spent 3 years, day after day, with a group of men who learned from him, who got to see what God was like, what the kingdom of heaven would be like. And day after day, Jesus is correcting their view of God, constantly. We don't just somehow have this download and whoop, this is God's reality. Day after day, we pick up things, we experience things, we read things that God longs to reveal himself and correct about himself, because he doesn't want to be misrepresented. How sad for Israel that they got so hyped up about this chunk of gold when they had the real thing on Mount Sinai. So, am I willing to abandon my false view of God? And it can be really uncomfortable. I recently had to do this. I discovered some things that I was really encouraged and I had grown through, and I discovered that the people that I had listened and heard this from, that they had some really distorted views of God, and I had to leave it behind. And it is an uncomfortable place to be. And second, do I desire Jesus' presence over his promise? When I am in the thick of it, when I'm sick or I am tired and going through trials, when I'm being tempted, when I've been wronged by someone or I'm feeling alone or discontent, is the reality of Jesus and his presence enough? If I never see my heart's desire, if I'm like Moses and I have the promised land in view, but I'm never going to quite get there. If this is all my life ever is Jesus enough? Am I content to be with him and his word? I love the way that Jesus talks to his disciples, and he uses the description of the sheep and how the sheep know his voice. I want to be a sheep who knows Jesus' voice. Because when I know his voice, the other ones, I'm going to be able to tell right away that they are counterfeits. I'm not going to get hyped up over something that isn't him. I'm not going to make Jesus' life and his teachings about myself, because he is interested in so much more than just me. His gospel is for the entire world.